Once was a swagman camped by a billabong, under the shade of a coolabah tree, as he sat as he watched and waited while his billy boiled. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Lukes at the Crossroads. We've got another interesting forum event today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Betty Lukes from Adelaide. Welcome, Betty.
Thank you, Arnie. Good morning.
And Wallace Klinck from Canada. Welcome, Wallace.
Yes, good evening, Arnie. It's good.
Good on you, Wally. Good sense of humour there. Okay, so where we left off last week was the individual, society, and devolution. Society being a combination of economics, politics, and culture. Society. These are the three essentially subheadings of the makeup of society. And devolution being the actual devolving, the bringing authority and responsibility back to the individual. So it's to me it's an interesting subject, and it certainly has a lot of history, because the history of political movements have always been frustrated, perhaps because they haven't been founded on a solid base, based on first principles. And that's why the Social Credit Lecture 4 about devolution is most important, because it brings us back to the first principle of where should authority vest. Now, we can see in Russia today that the oligarchy that's effective in that country, that's ruling that country, Putin being the front man or the PR man for the oligarchy, but it is an oligarchy, centralised power. The Russian people have very little say. They have a token election of which only the party really nominates candidates, and the rest are sort of swamped. And we also look at America and Australia, similar scenarios, where the major parties, Democrats and Republicans, work hand in hand to present their candidates, and it's only really from these two candidates that you get an opportunity for selection. In Australia, Conservatives and Labor, we throw in a spatch, what do you call it, a sprinkling of Greens and One Nation and Australian Conservatives, but in the end there really only is one party, and it's actually got two faces to it, and that is the Liberal Labor juggernaut, the one party. So these are the history of politics in our country, and also I know it's similar in Canada, similar in America, certainly the same in Russia. Now, how do we actually start to dismantle this? How do we actually get things back to where an even keel, where the individual has some say in his life and can make decisions that actually count, that affect him and his family? So I'm going to give Wally Klinck the floor to open up the salvos. Good morning, Wally.
Good morning, Arnie. I think we have to go back to the first principles. And Douglas, in his first book, Economic Democracy, made it very clear that we have to build up from the individual and not down from the state. In other words, that institutions, governments, institutions as such, exist to serve the individual. The individual does not exist to serve the institution, because you're trying to get results that redound to the advantage or benefit of individuals through your association. And through association, you can achieve more than you can as isolated individuals, because in association, you contribute and you end up actually getting more than you would have if you had individually applied your energies to the achievement of that objective. In other words, you get a profit. You get something that is more than you would otherwise have had. And our whole society is built, our civilization is built up upon these increased increments of association and into what we call a cultural heritage. And we build upon that cultural heritage as a base to make further progress. And it's very important that we essentially preserve that heritage, not just for the sake of preserving it, but for the practical reason that it gives us a base upon which to build. We don't have to go back to reinventing the wheel. We don't have to go back to inventing the lever. Those things are in the past, and we have them at our command, and we should use them to the best advantage and preserve them. So anyway, and then I suppose you're getting to the question of policy in terms of government and that sort of thing, the relationship of the individual to the politician. I had a friend who was actually the head of Unifarm, which was an agricultural union here. And the first thing he would ask a politician when the politician was on the stage or behind the podium, and the first thing he would do is to stand up and say, let's get one thing straight from the beginning. Are you satisfied with your wages? Now that immediately tended to make clear the proper relationship between the elector and the representative. In other words, if you're standing to serve the community, we're making a deal with you. Are you happy with your remuneration? If you are, then let's get on with it and take directions from us, the community, as to what policies we want. Not how to do it, but the broad policies.
Thank you, Wally. I think that's most important. That's exactly right. Are you satisfied with your wages or your terms and conditions of representing us? And I think this is a very important point. Now, I know I'm just going to plant the seed now that there's a bloke in history called William Wilberforce as a politician, and he campaigned against slavery. Now, I don't believe that he actually had a party machine behind him, but rather what he did was he had a policy. And based on that policy, he pursued that over such an extended period of time. In the end, the forces were irresistible and the whole parliament had to yield. And I think that that's most important, because what it did was it demonstrated, in my view, a principle. And that is that you can unite people behind a policy. But if you get confused about figureheads and basically Superman to save you, then you'll get confused and you're handing over responsibility to someone else when it vests in you as the individual. Okay, Betty Lukes.
Well, I think that comes out loud and clear by the fact that they ask for our vote. But the trouble is that people think that once they've voted, that's the end of their role in the system, and it is not. And you have to look back to history to see how the British people fought to ensure that there was no centralization of power. They did their best to separate powers, to give certain roles to certain parts of Parliament, things like that. And we've lost sight of all that. And we have to regain it. We have to understand it. If we're going to finish with some sort of a civilization, we're going to have to take a part in it. And we're not doing so. That's how I see it.
No worries. Thank you for that, Betty. That's an important point, that the individual has to engage and has to engage with the entire political process, and not just once every 3 or 4 years and putting a tick in a box. That won't cut the mustard. The engagement is much more than that. Wally Klinck.
Well, any culture or civilization is going to be as successful as the individuals that comprise it. And we have to, the British were involved in making certain institutions which had their respective field of responsibility and power, but did not have a monopoly of power. The idea was to separate power, legislative, executive, judicial, and that sort of approach. And is very critical, because otherwise, if you have a single source of power, it gets out of control and it begins to exceed its legitimate exercise of power. And of course, that leads to tyranny. And the British were very independent-minded as a people, and they did not want that type of situation arriving. Certainly, British Empire became a very powerful empire, but there was this very strong respect for and independence of the individual that pervaded their culture and their society. And So all developments come from initiative, and only by respecting the individual is that initiative going to be allowed to emerge and to exert its influence. Now, there are different people should be able to control their politicians, because after all, they have elected them to perform certain functions and to bring about certain policies. It's not for the people to give detailed instructions to the people who are hired by their representatives to achieve these ends. The thing of it is that you want to have a responsibility coming back on the representatives according to the success they have in enlisting people to bring about the policies that the people want. And if, of course, the elected representatives fail to do this, then you must have the option of replacing them. Now, but also you should, in order to have a proper relationship with your representative, you should not just vote for them every 4 or 5 years. You should have a line of communication with them where they know what you want and where you're applying pressure to them. Major Douglas, who originated social credit, said that really the worst possible thing would be for social credit to be promoted through political parties. That would be a disaster, because when you do that, the individuals tend to place everything in the hands of the parties in the expectation that they will do something, while the people just wait back for it to happen. And that is not a good situation, because you need a constant relationship, bringing pressure, communicating in order to make a successful relationship with your representatives and to get the results that you want. Otherwise, they will be subject to other forces that will lobby them or will bribe them or maybe blackmail them in one way or another, and the individual citizen will lose control of the initiative in determining policy.
Thanks for that.
Wally.
That's excellent. Sorry about the feedback. All right, I'm going to cut to Betty. I had some thoughts, but the system just bounced on me, so I'll pass it to Betty. Betty, you're up.
Thank you, Arnie. Well, I want to bring it to the recent news headlines that America and Britain and France have fired at Syria, supposedly to get rid of some what are they, poison gas?
Chemical weapons.
Chemical weapons. And the headlines in the Australian is that more or less that this trio are doing good. Well, I can assure you I don't think they're doing good at all. I will get on to the point in a minute, but I do ask the question. Are you trying to tell me, or are they trying to tell me, that America doesn't have chemical weapons? Are they trying to tell me that these other countries don't have chemical weapons? I don't believe it for 1 minute. Well, that's the trouble. I don't believe the so-called leaders of the Western world anymore. But if they go to war, and then we're subjected to the jingoism to see that our young are conscripted into war, I would suggest that Trump could ask his young son-in-law, who looks a very healthy young man, and I understand he's got a son too. I'd suggest that they be the first to volunteer if that's the case. And when it comes to Malcolm Turnbull here in Australia, well, let his son-in-law looks pretty healthy to me, let him be part of the cannon fodder. But do that before you ask me to encourage my grandsons to go, because I will not. Because first of all, I don't think that they should be doing what they're doing. And secondly, I just recently have been watching the film, The Pacific. What's his name? Spielberg and Tom Hanks were part of it in producing it. And to me, it reminded me of my own youth. I was about 13 or 14 when the war ended. And my father was in the services. I had two brothers in the services, but I also had a foster brother in the service, and he went to the Middle East to serve in the army, and he went to the New Guinea, north of Australia, of course, to fight the Japanese. And I can assure you, he came home with all the post-traumatic syndromes that the American soldiers had at the time. And that was personal experience, hearing him during the night when he was having his nightmares, and he was thumping the walls and just expressing his frustration and whatever. So don't tell me that we shouldn't be concerned about them making our children and grandchildren cannon fodder when the so-called leaders of the Western world don't have their children, their sons, their healthy young sons, being the first to line up. That to me is how I see that. I don't see the war is necessary. I see that we must approach these problems from a far different angle to what we have done for the last two wars and possibly the third one.
Thank you, Betty. Thank you, Betty, for that. I just see that what we're clearly touching on here on, is policy, and we're attempting to explain that in order for policy to be effective, it's got to come from, if you like, the community. Now, when it comes from the leaders as the dictator, we're going to go to war, we're going to have carnage, we're going to see another so many million people killed. And for what purpose? And of course, this is abhorrent. This is absolutely abhorrent. We shouldn't be there. We should not be blowing up these people. We should not be participating in this carnage. And for what derived benefit for our nation? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's just a theatre of war to test weapons. That's all it is. And of course, it's on the civilian population as much as anything else. It's not isolated just to strategic targets. It's abhorrent. Wally Klinck.
Yes, that's certainly true, Arnie. I think that, if you stop to think just for a moment how much better we would all be how better off we would be if we lived with in a state of harmony and cooperation with each other. I mean, this whole war thing over the last century has been a waste that is almost beyond description, and a tragedy for human beings. A tragedy in the lost opportunities they've had, in the suffering they've incurred, and a double tragedy in the fact that it hasn't really resolved anything. My own uncle just recently passed away in his 90s, and I visited him just very briefly before that, and he was looking at the television, and he said, I said, what do you mean? He said, well, he'd served in Holland and in northern France in military active duty during the Second World War. And he said, they told us that we were fighting for freedom and democracy. He said, look, it's pretty sad when somebody spends 3 or 4 years of their lives risking their lives for what they believe is a cause, and at the end of their life concludes that it was all a waste of effort. Not a very happy thought.
No, that's right. Thanks for that, Wally. They're very important points that come down to it. It's not just war we're talking about. War happens to be an extension of, if you like, economic war by other means. It moves into military. And Douglas warned us about that. So we've got to take a step back and say, well, what's actually getting us to the point where we've got trade sanctions? What's getting us to the point where one nation is vying with another nation over dwindling markets because of robotics, automation, advanced control? We can all outproduce each other. We have more than enough. What we can't do is we can't balance the books. And this is absolute madness. It's absolute madness that we've got a man-made system called the financial system. We've got if you like, a God-endowed system called the economic system. And this is where God has given his bounty to us. The revelation, the technology, the industrialization steam energy, electrical energy, nuclear energy. All these energies are there right in front of us, and we're harvesting it, and it's to the point where we have too much of everything. And then in amongst this, we fabricate gas incidents. We fabricate them. We, as the mainstream media and the military industrial complex, fabricate it out of nothing, put our own white helmets there and say this is actually happening. We're hosing down children. You can't handle people who've been gassed. You've got to be in a chemical suit or you're going to be poisoned yourself. And here they are hosing down children as if this is this is how you manage these chemical agents. I mean, the incident in Britain with the two Russians, the policeman went to attend and he was hospitalised. Yet these people with white helmets can attend the same thing, and they're hosing down. No gloves, no personal protection equipment. That's bullshit. That's what it is. Sorry for the swearing. It's frustrating, but that's just garbage. Betty Lukes.
Well, there you are, Arnie. You've hit the nail on the head there. And I just see it that it's the people who must put pressure on their own government, put pressure on Malcolm Turnbull to not get involved in these wars. And I make the point that my family have served their country over many years, actually. So it's not that we're not patriotic, but we're not stupid either. And this leadership would have us believe that we are stupid. And we must change the direction. We must. And as Arnie pointed out about C.H. Douglas, who made that BBC recording, The Causes of War. And it would do the viewers good to have a look at those and then decide for themselves, is this the way to go or is it not? And both McGilchrist and Peterson have expressed their concern because this time the leaders have enough power behind them, enough energy behind them to destroy civilization completely. Now, wake up, Australia. We really do need to wake up.
Thank you, Betty. Thank you for that. That's so important. I just want to reorientate our forum back to the initial subject, which of course is the individual in society, which is economic, political, and cultural, and of course devolution. And the direction that we need to understand here is, if all this power and authority vests with our politicians, it vests with our parliaments, then it's the cause of our actual own undoing, because we don't control the parliaments. We certainly don't control our politicians, and the party system is such where the politicians, once they're elected, they couldn't care less. They're quite happy. They've got skin of leather, and they'll completely ignore the electorate until such time as it comes back to re-election, and then they basically bribe the electorate to get back in. It's the lesser of two evils. Choose between Liberal and Labor, but they both plan together. They work in cahoots. They're the same party. They're just different branches, and that you've got to understand and come back to the teachings about dialectical materialism to realise that they use the opposites. They use opposites to argue. That's the new synthesis. This is how they argue. This is the tactics. They're actually outworking their own philosophy right in front of us. And we think that if we go to one side or we go to the other side, that we're going to make good. We've got all the working people supposedly aligned to Labor, and we've got all the professional or conservative people aligned to the Liberal, and you expect with this syncretism that you're going to actually create something new. I think it's a form of insanity, because you're repeating the same process and expecting a different result. Wally Klinck.
Yes, Betty, I'm glad you referred people to those two actually short talks that Douglas gave on the BBC on the causes of war. I know one observer said that he had not been, really that impressed with the arguments made by a lot of social creditors. But after having listened to Douglas, he said I took a very much more serious approach to the subject. He obviously a brilliant man. And anyway, Douglas said that, he who calls, well, I think it was another prominent social creditor who actually said, he who calls for war, for full employment calls for war.
John Hargraves.
Yeah, that's John Hargrave, who was a British activist for the social credit cause. He had quite a number of members, actually, in his organization from the Royal Aircraft, or the Royal Air Force, I should say, in Britain. And he was the inventor of a navigational device for aircraft, and quite a brilliant fellow. But he was quite flamboyant, and he liked to promote social credit by very visible public acts, where Douglas was more not inclined to that particular type of approach. But in any case, they were. So yes, the problem is that when we take either side, we're really supporting the same thing. They're all promoting full employment in a world where scientists are doing their best, and engineers and technologists are doing their best to eliminate employment. But the politicians are all trying to create it, allegedly, which strikes one as a rather incomprehensible and contradictory situation. And it is, of course, because it's the wrong policy. And you had mentioned the economic aspect of it. We are in a situation where everyone is competing for a shrinking pie. And of course, as the pie shrinks, the competition gets heavier. And the competition is not only amongst individuals, it is amongst jurisdictions, governments, and nations. And as the competition gets more intense, the degree of the situation just develops where there's a harsher and harsher atmosphere, and it inevitably will burst out in war. And it has burst out in war. It's been demonstrated repeatedly, I should say almost continuously, that is exactly what does happen, because we've been at war all of the last century practically, and right into this current century, it's continuing without cessation. So, and it is because there is not enough purchasing power going to the individual consumer in each nation to allow him or her to purchase what we are currently producing and to liquidate the costs of that production. The only way you can do it increasingly is to borrow money, which just puts an obligation to be settled or claimed from future cycles of production. In other words, it doesn't really liquidate costs, it just transfers them to the future. We're living today by borrowing on the future, but you can't eat next year's crop. It's not here yet. You can't drive next year's automobile. It's not here yet. It's a delusion. It's an illusion. It's an insanity. We should, surely, if you're engaged in any activity, when the activity is completed, you should be able to enjoy the benefits that accrue from that activity. You're not allowed to do that today until we do something else. And that causes us to be involved in all sorts of irrelevant activities, destructive activities, especially with the American economy being 50% or so concerned with war activities and production. It means that our whole lives are distorted. Our activities are skewed and perverted to ends which are not to the satisfaction of humans, but actually to their great disadvantage and even destruction.
Thank you, Wally. That's very important for us to orientate us to what is actually going on, and come back to first principles. And that's what's the purpose of the system, and is the system achieving its purpose? Betty Lukes.
What's the purpose of the system? Well, I think that Jesus told us the purpose of the economic system. He said life is more important. And then I think it was raiment and food, clothes and food. And after all, clothes and food are for the sustaining and maintaining of life. And if Christians can't see that, then I don't know what on earth they do see when they read the words of Jesus. And I see we've got to come back to that. But Wally, I was interested in the email that you sent around this morning about what happened within the social credit government over there in Canada. And I wonder if you'd like to refresh your memory on what the email you sent around, because you really were describing just what's happening now.
Okay, sorry, Betty. I'm just going to cut to Wally. Wally.
Yes, Betty, certainly. I was born in 1934 in the province of Alberta, and so I was with the whole experience of the social credit movement during that period. And it was in Alberta that the first so-called social credit government was ever elected, and they literally swept the old United Farmers government, practically decimated them. And this was time that during the Great Depression, when people were being put off their farms and families were sitting at the crossroads, and it was, a dreadful situation. And anyway, of course, Mr. Eberhard had an evangelistic radio program, and he'd already had a considerable following to draw from. And he was introduced to a book by Morris Colburn called The Meaning of Social Credit. Originally it was called Economic Nationalism, but it was changed to The Meaning of Social Credit, and he was quite impressed with this book. And he began to preach the social credit message. And so it became quite well known, and through his activities, which were ongoing and regular. And eventually, when this new government took over, Eberhard did not run, but someone vacated their seat and made room for him to run, and then he became the premier, of course. And of course, people had great hopes, and many people, really sacrificed enormously in order to promote the cause. And women were very involved in this too. I must say, very involved. And so, in any case, Eberhard did not really understand the situation that well, and there was a delay, and there were some members of the legislature who rather rebelled and demanded that he bring forth results. Anyway, Douglas had sent a couple of emissaries over from Britain to advise the government, and they had made, considerable progress in doing that. But unfortunately, Eberhard, just after he had made a really powerful discussion or presentation on the radio dealing with the financial powers and how they were trying to centralize their control over society and civilization. Shortly after that, he went to BC, and we're told that he ate a salad on the train and that he became very ill and died. And a lot of people speculate about that. There was no proof, I don't think, of what might have happened. But in any case, the thing took a completely different course because Mr. Ernest Manning, who was a very young person at that time, had joined Eberhard in his religious broadcasts, and he continued on with the political activities, and he took over the party. And as soon as he did, he almost immediately started a purge of the very best social creditors. And they were discredited, and they were, they could no longer get elected. There were one or two that held out because of their extreme popularity, but the study courses, study groups that had been set up became degraded because the genuine message was no longer followed. In fact, Douglas's books were even incinerated, apparently, according to what they told me. Some of the MLAs who I associated with related a number of these things. And as time went on, of course, it just became Douglas said it was more of a socialist type of government in a way, but it was regarded as conservative. And Manning was able to, I think, more or less get the support of the general media because he was following the prescribed course. He'd betrayed the movement. And just before his retirement, he said that social credit no longer had the answers that were relevant to the problems of the modern age. And he had also said that there's absolutely nothing, and this was his religious angle coming out again, nothing that people can do to solve the problems of this world until they waited for the return of their Lord and Redeemer, Jesus Christ. In other words, it was a complete denial of the encouragement, of the initiative of the individual. It was just a squelch. And of course, well, he held office for decades, actually, and had position and got an honorary degree from the university and all of the usual things. And that's what happened. And anyway, the lesson is that political parties, as Douglas said, are not a way to promote social credit. Political parties are a locus. They are an organization and they have a center. That center is subject to infiltration and to direct influence by outside parties which have an ulterior motive. And when you get an organization that is centralized that way, it is very susceptible to that sort of influence. And that's what happened in Alberta. It was simply taken over by external influences which didn't announce themselves directly, but which exercised control from behind the scenes. And that's what happened. So in other words, Douglas stressed the idea that individual initiative, for instance, we did have in Alberta here and in Canada, we had VPAs, or Voters Policy Associations, where a group of people would get together who had common concerns, maybe different talents, but associating together in groups of half a dozen or so, they could work on problems and then initiate a program, a letter writing program to their representatives to try and influence them, to educate them and influence them. And this thing was beginning to take hold, and it certainly did in Britain. But then, of course, when the war came along, the whole thing was aborted because of the necessities of the war effort. And the war really did damage to the social credit movement, which had made much progress up till that time.
Thank you, Wally. I'm going to just give a heads up that I want to talk about my experiences in Queensland with One Nation and Australia First, but I want to give Betty the floor. Betty.
Well, I don't want the floor much. I'll leave it to you, Arnie. I just am thinking, when we look, we have a so-called Liberal government in power in Canberra now, and on the Liberal Party's Statement of Beliefs of 1949, it's saying very clearly that they believe in freedom of speech. Well, I can assure you, it doesn't matter, as Eric Butler used to say, it doesn't matter what the label says on the jar when there's a pink substance inside the jar that is strychnine. And that's really where we are now. The label means nothing. And we were told that. Why do you call me Lord and don't do the things I say? And it's the same that the political parties, I don't care what their label is, what do they actually do? What do they vote for? What do they promote? What do they get out there in the community and say, look, this particular government is going the wrong way. This is where we think it should be going, or what do you people think? Bring it back to the people. But as it was pointed out, we had one politician who has changed parties twice before and was for 12 years on the opposition benches. Well, for 12 years he sat on his backside. Did he get out there in the community and ask them what they wanted? No. He was too busy enjoying the fruits of office. I'll leave that to you now, Arnie.
Okay, thanks for that, Betty. I'm going to touch on my experience because Wally talked about the how parties can be quickly circumvented and how entire political movements can come unstuck. Now, 22 years ago, there was an Australia First movement working in Queensland, and the people there, the Queenslanders, had worked for 18 months, and that was just a They were just mum and dad workers, and they were out there and they were canvassing the electorate, and they were planting seeds about policy, about initiatives, about what I think were either 8 or 10 core policies of the Australian First Movement. And it was about protecting jobs, industry. It was things that the average person would have no trouble endorsing as policy. And the fact is that because it was actually making headway, and they had every chance of success in quite a few electorates in Queensland, the media created a phenomena, and the phenomena was called Pauline Hanson One Nation. Now, while the media was creating it, the Conservative Liberals were actually manning the critical posts in there, and I name them: David Ettridge, David Oldfield were in position, and if they weren't actual members of the Liberal Party or had been members of the Liberal Party, they certainly did the work of the Liberal Party. And there's also another name there I'll put in, and that is Tony Abbott, who was involved with the head kicking. He was part of the, if you like, in the book 1984, the head pig had these barking dogs, and if that wasn't Tony Abbott, I don't know what is. But anyway, the phenomena was created. Pauline Hanson, all the disenchantment that was going through Queensland for their local state election, the ferment was directed towards her. And Murdoch, as the mainstream media, the major news channels covered it, the regional news channels covered it. She had what was estimated at 100 million in that time, 20 years ago, 100 million worth of free advertising to direct that ferment and that energy towards her campaign, One Nation, rather than Australia First, because Australia First was about policy, and it was about policies that were antagonistic to the Conservatives and certainly antagonistic to the collectivist Marxists within the Conservatives and also the Labor movement. And certainly I don't think the Greens were actually active at that time. That was probably before they were conceived. But the point is that all that energy was directed through organisations, and it was circumvented in one campaign. Now, in one campaign, all that momentum, years of work was lost. Years of work was lost. Now, come back to campaigns that have been successful, and I will bring it back to Wilberforce, because the principle is correct. Wilberforce really had one objective, and that was the abolition of slavery as a policy. And it didn't matter whether it was Black, Brown or Brindle who was supporting him. He had a policy, and he had it based on his philosophy, and that was that every man is created free, moral, responsible. But free is the first word. He is free. You cannot own another human being as a chattel. You cannot. It's unethical. It's certainly against anything that stands within Christianity, and it's just abhorrent in the sense that one person is there as something that is beautiful and has the spark of divinity in them, and the next person, of course, they've got exactly the same. So how dare you have influence or control over that person as a slave, as a chattel? So Wilberforce campaigned, and others joined in that campaign, and they pursued it. Now, until it was concluded and abolished. Now we've got wage slaves. This whole nation is enslaved through wages. A whole nation is enslaved, and yet, where are the beacons on the hill? Where are they talking about this wage slavery? Talking about enslaving our children generationally. They can't clear their mortgages for their entire life and their children's working career as well. We're mortgaging for a house that's built today. We're mortgaging future work for an entire generation and the next generation. In Japan, it goes exactly the same. We saw it on with Japan. Now, this is madness. This is madness. You've got to think in the real world. You've got to take your blinkers off and don't think in financial terms, but think in the real terms. When I go and build a shed in my backyard for the chooks to sleep in, and it's under the council maximum number of square metres, so it's all legal, I can build a shed without council approval, and I build it, the price is paid when the building is completed. The price is paid. The materials are there, they're used, they're put in position, the building is completed, the price is paid. Now, how is it that when we build a house, we've got to mortgage our future work generationally? It's witchcraft. We're confused. And we've got to come back to this. Now, just to conclude this particular stanza of my argument, we had a bloke called Denison Miller as the governor, first governor of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and he released credits in a period from roughly 1912, 1914 until 1924. He released credits, and a lot of them were debt-free for new projects. And so we went through a period of infrastructure development over 12 years, unprecedented in our history. Not only that, we also processed the entire First World War, and we came out of this debt-free. Now, we weren't mortgaging future generations worth of debt. We concluded the execution of the war and these infrastructure projects, and the price was paid in the construction of them, or the execution of the war. The price was paid. There's no more debt. It's paid. Now, Britain, on the other hand, executed the First World War and was in debt for 5 generations, for over 100 years. 100 years, and yet the actual execution of the war, all the materials, the resources, the human effort, the energy, was all paid for at that time. Now, if we don't start to get our head around these sorts of things, if we don't take the blinkers off our eyes and look and say, this is the real world, this is not the pseudo black magic world, this is the real world of how things are. And we've got to come back to first principles. Are we free? If we're free, then we're free. And we've got to act on that basis, and that's why we always come back to these. I'm going to give Wally a chance at the floor while I take a breath.
Well, you're really getting me exercised, I must say. It's not funny, but we're certainly not free. We are slaves, absolutely slaves to debt. And I think I was just talking to my younger brother on the other day, and he said that he had just noticed that the world debt is 3 times as much as the national product. 3 times. I forget the figure. I think it was 300 some billion, if I'm not mistaken.
Trillion.
49 or something. Anyway, it's an enormous difference. And one has to ask the question, how could you have financial debt when, Arnie, as you say, when something is produced and the real cost being the materials and energy, human and non-human, are the real cost? How is it that you end up with a residuum at the end of the production process with a financial debt? It doesn't make sense. It's simple. And it's because of the way that the financial system works, the way the credit system works. Money is prematurely canceled, so it's not available to buy the goods that you're working on when they come out. And this is a build-up, a deficiency that builds up and builds up and builds up, and it's met by increasing debt. It allows you, where it is allowed, to access the goods in question, but the problem is you get the goods in question and they're paid for by a loan, but now you have a debt. In other words, it hasn't really liquidated the costs of production. It has merely transferred those costs as a charge against the future, which is quite, if you think about it, it seems to be quite insane, really, absolutely. But it's not insane if you think about it in terms of the policy that might be followed by those who want to centralize wealth and power over the community. Then it makes a lot of sense, because it definitely does serve their purpose. So we have a dreadful thing that has befallen us due to our own ignorance and the fact that we have been propagandized incessantly to keep us occupied with relative irrelevancies or amusements, bread and circuses of the Roman Empire, and our educational system has not dealt with these things in a constructive manner, and simply students come out without any real understanding of them, and so we go on and fall more and more into the trap without realizing what's going on. And I mean, and you were talking about politicians. We have the present federal conservative leader who was trying to get on the bandwagon, and he said that there's some, with regard to Jordan Peterson, for instance, that he would even go for defunding some of these universities. But he was the one as the Speaker of the House, who instituted absolutely draconian restrictions on freedom of speech for the people who worked in the House of Commons, getting them to sign that they would literally, I think, if I'm not wrong, jeopardize their pensions if they spoke about anything after they leave the employ of the House. Now, do you really think that he is going to defend freedom of speech? Now, we know that in Canada, it's the Liberals who have really been the active participants in damaging freedom of speech through all their anti-hate legislation and things like that, because they're the ones who really have pushed it. There has been token response from the Conservatives, but I don't think too many Conservatives would really take a very strong position if they felt it might adversely affect their fortunes in the political realm. And here we have another situation in Alberta right now. There was apparently a fairly major anti-abortion demonstration of the legislature, and the new provincial leader of the Conservative Party, who I understand had, in his communications with constituents, made it very clear he was going to take strong steps about this sort of thing, and especially about the new radical sex education in the schools. But he didn't show up. He didn't show up. You see, he doesn't want to take a chance of alienating a certain sector of the population, so he's playing it safe, it appears, by just not showing up. Now, I don't think that's a great statement, a demonstration of commitment to principle.
Thanks for that, Wally.
It's typical of the political process.
Yeah, thanks for that, Wally.
The people simply have to overcome that by taking the initiative themselves and saying, look, this is what we want, and we're going to have it.
Thank you, Wally. That's an excellent example of if we can put our hopes in the politicians, especially career politicians, and they know how to play both sides of the fence perfectly, and the only thing they're really looking at is they're looking at protecting themselves. And we saw that recently with our with this upper house politician who's he'll change his trousers any time of day, whatever suits, to his own advantage. It's pathetic. Betty Lukes.
Well, I think that the whole history of Parliament over the last 100 years shows where we're heading, where we've come from, and where we're heading. And it's, if people put their faith in politicians or parties, then they're going to get what they deserve. And there's no saviour there. There's no saviour. But history shows that it has to be the people themselves who take the responsibility and insist on. But they've got to have a system themselves and understand that while they can't do a lot of things on their own, they can if they join together. That's what social credit refers to, of the individuals joining together and achieving a target that they have set their goals on. That's the social credit.
That's it. That's right. That's exactly right. The social credit answer. And of course what you're referring to is the energy or increment of association, where people working together can achieve these things. I'm reminded, I'm going to do one last lap because we're up to the 54-minute mark. I'm reminded of when the disciples were, I don't think I'm wrong. The disciples are in the boat and they'd been fishing with the nets all day and they'd caught nothing. They continued to throw the net out and they caught nothing. And Jesus was on the beach and he looked at them and he said, throw your net on the other side. And they were able to pull in sufficient to almost break the net and capsize the boat. And that's really where we're at. If we continue as a community, if we continue to pursue the same methods, the same policies, the same efforts, if we continue to pursue these things knowing that they've failed in the past, then we will achieve nothing. We will just frustrate ourselves. What we've got to do is cast the net on the other side. And that is come back to these first principles which Jesus gave us All power and authority is within. The kingdom of God is within you. Mammon is the root of all evil. The root of all evil is the love of money, or the preference above all other things of money. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Government was made to serve man. These are first principles. And if we can't bring our understanding back to these first principles, we're going to continue to make the same mistakes. And really, seriously, I mean, I play with computers all the time, and I know I'm as bad as anyone else. I'll type in the same thing again and again, hoping for a different result. It won't happen. You've got to change your thinking, and you've got to reorientate yourself and cast your net on the other side. All right, now round up for today. Wally Klinck, have you anything further for the forum?
Well, you talk about the other side. Now, people do not realize it because they have not been exposed to it in recent decades. But social credit is an approach to economics and life, but it is basically it's a study of association and how to make associations successful for individual satisfaction. It's a generic thing in a sense. It applies across the board. People do not realize, and conservatives especially do not seem to realize, that they are serving a policy. It's not just something that's happening up there. We are following essentially the economics of a very specific school of thought, the Keynesian thought. In other words, it's a debt system of finance, which is absolutely destructive of the principles of freedom and of association and speech and all of that sort of thing. And but conservatives don't seem to realize that. They just go blindly battering on and on and on without understanding that they are themselves the victim of a system. Now, social credit is the other side, but it's a much more realistic side. This other side is to concentrate wealth and power amongst individuals, amongst corporations, and above all, it's centered in the banking system, the international banking system, which literally controls all activity through its ability to create and destroy credit to activate the resources of the community. And it's all working toward the centralization of power directed to a world administration of some form or another. And this is it's a cancerous, it's growth. It's not a normal thing. It's a growth that is strangling humanity. It cannot work because if you're going to put initiative in a center of power someplace in the world, you are draining it from individuals. And that way you are draining the community of its very vitality. And so freedom is gone.
Thank you, Wally. I'm just going to highlight to our viewers before I give you the floor, Betty, that on the website alor.org in our library, you've got a very good book there written by a British fella called Malcolm Muggeridge, and it's called The Great Liberal Death Wish, and there it is there. And if you go to that, you'll see that the flaw within the conservative movement, this is nothing new. This goes back hundreds of years. In fact, the initial, the Tonnage Act 1694 in Britain, where they formed their first central bank, the Bank of England. And this is hundreds of years old, this strategy. You're not going to overcome it in 5 minutes, but the first thing you've got to do is understand it. All right, Betty Lukes, last comments, please.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? That we have to understand the forces that are strangling us, and if we really want to have freedom, we're going to have to fight for it. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much, Betty. That's exactly right. We are going to have to fight for it. There are good people out there, and they're doing good work, but they need a bit of guidance, and it's got to come back to first principles in order to be effective. Arnie Lukes from the Crossroads. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong, under the shade of a coolabah tree, as he sat as he watched and waited while his billy boiled. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? Good morning.